Welcome to the call today, Black Postal Lives Matter. We're so excited to be with you all today. My name is Bianca Cunningham. I'm based out of Brooklyn, New York. I am a former co-chair of Democratic Socialists of America in New York City, and also co-founder of the Afro-Socialist and Socialists of Color Caucus nationwide of the DSA. Today we're gonna have a great conversation. We've got some amazing panelists and we're gonna learn something from all of this fire that we have on the call today. And so I want to first introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Mack Julion. Mack is from the National Association of Letter Carriers and the president of the local there in Chicago. Next, we have Courtney Jenkins, who is a member and a steward for the American Postal Workers Union, and also the organization and legislative director in Baltimore for the local there. Next, we have Ajamu De La Hunt. Ajamu was a steward and a member of American Postal Workers Union. He also was the local president and state director of research and education, as well as an arbitration advocate. Ajamu is also representing Black Workers for Justice in Raleigh, from Raleigh, North Carolina. So welcome, Ajamu. And last but not least, we have Philip Rubio, who's a former letter carrier and author of There's Always Work at the Post Office, African-American Postal Workers in the Fight for Jobs, Justice, and Equality. And Undelivered, from the Great Postal Strike of 1970 to the Manufactured Christ of the US Postal Service. So we're so happy to have all of you on the call today. Welcome. We're gonna talk some history. We're gonna talk about the 1970s postal workers strike. We're gonna talk about the connection of Black liberation struggles in this country to the Postal Service and to postal workers. And we're going to talk about present day struggles and what we need to do to fight for the next day. And so this is going to be really exciting. We're going to get started with Philip, who's going to really ground us and give us some really good history so that we can start the conversation off right. So without further ado, Philip. Philip, you're on mute.
Thanks, Bianca. Yes. So can everybody see the, is it on the screen, the PowerPoint?
Yep, looks great.
Okay. All right, so let's see. Sorry, I need to move it so I can actually,
I think if you go to slideshow, it'll just start to, like, you can go through and click, right?
let me try that. Great. So, okay, thanks. Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about giving a brief background history of Black participation at the post office and its unions from 1865 to the 1970 strike, and then Ajamu is going to pick from there and back and CJ. We're talking about a story of Black labor activism that's civic, that's social, and that's political. So why were these individuals working at the post office? So you can, and these are just a few of the people who were suggested to me by a number of African-American friends and colleagues who said, did you know that? Okay, and that would start a conversation. So for instance, we have the first mayor of Detroit, Coleman Young, whose father was actually a letter carrier as well. We have Percy Sutton and Hiram Little, Tuskegee Airmen. We have left activists like Harry Haywood and Hubert Harrison. We have famous artists like Morgan Freeman, Charles Mingus, and Dick Gregory. He used the post office in between gigs or when there was a drought of their gigs. And then we have civil rights activists, for example, and I don't know if the way I have my screen, The other videos are blocking this up, but can everybody see that? So this would be Wesley Law from Georgia. This would be Reverend Harold Middlebrook from Memphis, Tennessee. This would be Buck Colbert Franklin, John Hope Franklin's father, postmaster, and a lawyer in Tulsa, just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Amzie Moore from Ruleville, Mississippi, using the civil service and also postal unions as protection for activism. So why were they working at the post office? I mean, it was there as a way station en route to another job. There were Black worker networks there. The post office was also there if they wanted to have a long career. In the case of famous novelist Richard Wright, he worked as a Chicago mail clerk from the late 20s to the early 30s, and his posthumously published last novel, Laud Today, is based on his experiences. Okay, so I used some economics studies, some economist studies that show that even by 1940, Black postal workers were in the top 5% of Black wage distribution. About 14% of all Blacks who were in the middle class worked for the post office. 28% had some college education. There were 5 Black PhDs working at mid-century in the Minneapolis post office. And even by 2000, Black postal workers were in the top 25% of Black earners and above the US median. They were at least 2.5 times as likely to work at the post office as whites by 1970. And the figures are even higher in some cities. So this was let's see if I can, okay. This was a working class job with middle class status in the Black community, okay? The pay wasn't great. It was better at times than the 2 decades before the strike of 1970, but it was steady pay, benefits. It had the government stamp, the imprimatur. There was job security allowed for of wealth, transfer of wealth to younger generations, higher education for children, home ownership, and to be social activists, with that, again, with civil service and protection. Ebony Magazine in 1949 called the post office a great, yes, okay.
Still, I'm sorry, you're breaking up a little bit. It might help if you turned off your camera. It sometimes helps the audio.
Okay. Let's see.
I did it for you.
All right. Is that better?
Slightly, yeah.
Is that better?
It's a little better, yeah.
Okay. So, so Ebony Magazine called the post office a graveyard of Negro talent. At the same time, it acknowledged that it was the largest employer of African Americans. The Memphis Tri-State Defender in 1963 observed the same thing. So in a 14-year span, you have African American participation in the post office, or employment at the post office, jumping from 12 to 20%. It's 23% full-time employees. I like to think in terms of total employees. Like today, it's over 633,108 because of the 136,174 part-time workers. Everybody starts as a part-time worker. I started as a PTF or sub, but figures are can be typically skewed, referring to them as full-time. But the Postal Service is still one of the largest employers of African Americans. Since 1865, it's been a kind of job migration magnet. Why is that? It served as a refuge from racist job exclusions in the private sector, both by employers and white employees. It was a basis they could use for advancement and militancy. And again, those social networks created a niche. And African Americans brought their protest traditions, from Reconstruction era South, to the North, to the West, combine it with other traditions, European immigrant, Caribbean immigrant, and they played a crucial role in progressive changes at the post office. One thing that they did was making the fight for equality primary rather than secondary, okay? This culminated and really made possible the Great Postal Wildcat Strike of 1970, which did lead to a living wage, finally led to full collective bargaining rights, and the compromise of postal reorganization, where the Post Office Department became the U.S. Postal Service effective 1971. So postal laws from 1802 to 1865 limited postal work to, quote, free white persons only. It was based on a white fear of the Haitian Revolution, actually by the Gideon Granger, the Postmaster General at the time, who authored who was the inspiration behind that act. It was a white fear of the Haitian Revolution inspiring Blacks in the United States. That law was repealed the same day the Freedmen's Bureau Act was passed, March 3rd of 1865. So by the very late 19th century, and especially into the early 20th century, we find African Americans joining postal unions. Unions that had, by the way, no collective bargaining rights. They only had lobbying power with Congress, okay? So they might join the National Association of Letter Carriers, National Federation of Post Office Clerks, the Mail Handlers Union, the Historically Black Alliance, or NAPE, and smaller craft unions like maintenance, motor vehicles, special delivery messengers, possibly the rural carriers. There were something like a dozen unions at any one time in the first half of the 20th century. First generation, we find a lot of Black Civil War, Union Army soldiers, and abolitionists and other activists. In defiance of federal law, William Cooper Nell became the first known Black postal worker. He was a clerk in Boston. His postmaster was an abolitionist. John Curry was the first Black clerk and then carrier in DC in 68 and in 1870. And then William Harvey Carney, here he is in New Bedford wearing his Union Army greatcoat over his postal uniform, ran from slavery in 1838 from Norfolk, Virginia to New Bedford, joined the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and he was the flag bearer on that famous assault on Fort Wagner. Became a letter carrier after the war in 1869 by Republican Party patronage, appointment, and he became the first vice president of NALC Branch 18 in 1890. Generation two, I look at activists, scholars, and entrepreneurs. So postal patronage, Republican Party patronage with the 1883 Civil Service Act, they're now scoring high enough on exams to be hired in growing numbers, provided they can get past the notorious rule of three, where personnel officers had that discretion to pick one out of every three in a batch of 3 applicants. Wayne Cox and his wife, Minnie Cox, they founded a savings bank in Indianola, Mississippi. They were run out of town by a white mob when Minnie Cox was appointed postmaster in 1902. There was harassment of Black postmasters in the South. Some were lynched. Hubert Harrison, a Black nationalist and socialist leader in New York, and he was also a postal clerk, one among many who had study groups. He was actually fired by postal management, who were friends of Booker T. Washington, whom he criticized. Blacks were among the first railway postal clerks. They were increasingly displaced by 1913 as safety conditions became greater with the railroad cars. They attracted more whites. The Alliance, or National Alliance of Employees, formed in 1913 after the Railway Mail Association banned Blacks in 1912. The Alliance became essentially a civil rights union. They fought President Wilson's segregation, and they also fought the civil service application photos that were used to screen out Blacks starting in 1914. And then it became an industrial union, that means all crafts, in 1923. At their peak, they represented about 1/3 of all Black postal workers, many of whom had dual memberships with the craft unions. And they also, at their peak, were roughly 5 to 10% white and Latino. So by World War I, African Americans made up about 10% of all postal employees. This is a Memphis marching band of NALC Branch 27. So you can see by the low number, they were one of the originals, okay? Founded in 1889, first year that the NALC was founded. The first president, David Washington was probably the first Black letter carrier in Memphis. This is a 1954 photo, and there are no white members. That's because the whites in Memphis split to form their own branch in 1946. There were 38 separated branches, and they throughout the South that were merged in 1962. But the interesting thing is to see how African Americans still exerted power in the NALC state associations of Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, Tennessee, and Virginia, despite Jim Crow. They also utilized social networks like the Masons. And they also combined with the NAACP to get rid of the discriminatory photo application. That would have been 80 years ago yesterday, Executive Order 8587, the FDR signed right after the election, right after he won his third term. So combined with the labor shortage of World War II in 1941, the Fair Employment Practices Committee that was a product of Executive Order 8802 and Black protests led by A. Philip Randolph, you start to see a surge of Black post office jobs and also activism against Jim Crow. And at the post office and the unions are more women being hired. Because of the Hatch Act, well, first of all, overwhelmingly masculinist workplace till the late 60s. You even had gendered job registers till 1962. The Alliance was an early pioneer against that. The Hatch Act in 1939 barred political activities by government employees, but women's auxiliaries, or ladies' auxiliaries, as unions often called them, we were able to carry out many of these activities. And the Alliance especially was involved in that. This is Heman Sweat. I think I forgot to mention him in the picture collage I had, but he was the plaintiff in the Sweat v. Painter Supreme Court decision that integrated the University of Texas Law School. He was a letter carrier in Houston, and he was a member of that quite lively Houston NAACP branch that had everything from conservatives to communists. So seeing this change in Jim Crow and the postal unions, mostly in the South, I should say that they're leading it from the outside, but also from the inside. Many of them joined the NALC, the letter carriers, and the NFPOC, the clerks union. We also, another example of a dual membership, Bertram Washington, not only belonged to the Alliance, and also in the Cleveland and the Cleveland clerks, Local 72, but he was also active with the Communist Party, the Civil Rights Congress, and the National Negro Labor Council. So what I look at in the 20th century is that Black postal workers are joiners and doers, okay? You had a Mississippi letter carrier by the name of P.M.E. Hill. He was an African-American letter carrier who led Blacks and whites against Jim Crow in the NALC. They abolished it in 1939. For 20 years, they fought off Jim Crow attempts. He actually owned a plantation in Mississippi. He was independently wealthy, but he also carried the mail. 1941, the NALC voted to allow Jim Crow branches, and they added more in 48. The struggle against these Jim Crow branches ends in 1962, and it's also one of the ways that that African Americans, I think, pulled whites in especially cities in the North into the struggle for equality. These were two individuals I spoke to as part of my oral histories. I did something like 100 interviews between my two books. Raydell Moore on the West Coast, the National Postal Union, later and joined the APWU, and then Cleveland Morgan NALC branch 36. Raydell Moore was there when there was a walkout of the clerks union in '58. They call it the Boston Tea Party over democracy and Jim Crow issues. And then the NPU later, folds into the APWU. African Americans are taking civil rights struggles into the NALC and the NPU, so they're starting to let go of their alliance membership. The first 3 urban Black postmasters are also appointed in the 60s as a result of this upsurge and grassroots activity. Leslie Shaw in Los Angeles in '63, Henry McGee in Chicago in '66, and John Strawn in New York City in '67.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're a little over time, so if you could just wrap up in the next couple minutes.
Sure. So the 1960s saw a spike in the number of Black women hired at the post office, as many men were in the Evelyn Craig Brown, hired in DC, the first Black female letter carrier since World War II. Eleanor Bailey, 1970, she was a rank and file leader in New York City. Yeah, I just have a couple of slides. By 1960, Chicago, LA, DC, and New Orleans were majority Black post offices. And at that time, many other cities were largely African-American, like 40% or more. Detroit, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Atlanta, Memphis, Houston, New York City, and San Francisco. We also see postal workers frustrated with low pay and no raises. This growing labor management conflict. The Chicago Mail shutdown of 1966 leads to the Capitol Commission report recommending postal corporatization. But the post office is 88.7% unionized by 1968. You can see how low postal wages were in 1970. Even for that time, they were low enough for postal workers to be applying for welfare and getting food stamps. And then they were threatening to go on strike. The postal reform legislation was stuck in Congress, and starting in New York City, over 200,000 workers struck 671 offices over 8 days. It was illegal. It was a wildcat strike that was unauthorized by the unions. It defied the national union's national leadership. It started in New York, but spread to the Northeast, the Midwest, and the far West. And they even took strike votes in the South, even though they didn't go out there. So Black workers played a crucial role in this strike from where it started. It also ended in the same place in New York City. They won a 14% pay raise, full collective bargaining rights, and the compromise that became the U.S. Postal Service, government agency / business, as well as greater union democracy with a new bargaining unit in 1971 with the NALC, the APWU, the mail handlers, and the rural letter carriers. So last, I want to return to my subtitle, African American Postal Workers and the Fight for Jobs, Justice, and Equality, because this continues to be primarily a story of Black labor activism in the largest and fastest growing unionized sector, namely government service. And the question I pose is, will these jobs and that service survive and thrive? And make the final point here that grassroots activity matters a lot.
Wow, thank you so much, Phil, for all that. I know that I found it very useful, and I hope that we all learned something from that. Next, we're going to hear from Ajamu. So Ajamu, please, your opening remarks.
Good. Good evening. Thank you, Bianca. I want to express my appreciation to DSA for pulling this together. And it's especially important in this political moment of the COVID pandemic, the pandemic of growing racism and white nationalism, and of course, the extreme crisis of capitalism. Although I'm retired, I was a second generation postal worker. My dad was a World War II veteran who became a clerk in 1949 and was a member of the National Alliance of Postal and Federal Employees that Phil mentioned. And my brother and I worked as Christmas casuals and summer seasonal employees before I put in 24 years as a clerk. So I'm going to maybe overlap Phil a little bit, maybe try to deepen some of those points before I get to 1970. But, without a doubt, the post office has been an integral part of the African-American social, political, and social life, or cultural life of this country. As he pointed out, it's a central place of employment. And two factors, I think, that have made this case the important thing is that they hire veterans by mandate who get a 10-point bonus on the test and the civil service exam itself. And that's not to say that there were not other barriers that worked against hiring people of other races, barriers like postmasters and hiring officials. But these two factors made it a little easier for Black workers to find employment. So consequently, you get a postal workforce that has large concentrations of veterans, college educated folks and professionals looking to move on at some point. Veterans of World War I and II, Korea, and Vietnam, for example, came force unprepared to tolerate racism and bad treatment from white bosses or even a handful of their Black surrogates. And certainly those with college education and what we call working class seekers of knowledge and consciousness filled the ranks of the workforce in the North, in the South, in the East, and mainly in the urban areas though. So with this kind of demographic then and now, there was always community activists that you see. So Phil gave a long list of them, which is really good. People affiliated with local groups fighting against racism and injustice. And you know, there are thousands who are unnamed in the recorded histories. But there have been those prominent activists who Phil mentioned. I just want to mention two. And one he mentioned was Herbert Harrison. And our friend, a former postal worker and historian, Jeff Perry, in his great book, Hubert Harrison, The Voice of Harlem Radicalism, points out that Harrison was a Caribbean immigrant and a socialist activist. I just want to emphasize that since this is a DSA event. And as was pointed out, he came into conflict with Booker T. Washington. He criticized him, and Washington brought all his forces together, including the postmaster of New York City, to fire Hubert Harrison. So just a little example of class struggle in the Black freedom movement in the early 1900s. And then in Chicago, James Ford and Harry Haywood, who became associated with the Communist Party, they were prominent leaders. And Haywood talks about the rich discussions that used to take place amongst postal workers, the Sunday study groups and discussion meetings and whatnot, where they talked about conditions facing Black people, politics, history, even anthropology. And you know, I would even say that from my experience, those kind of study groups have been replicated over the years in postal services across the country, and I hope people are doing it now. And of course, many organizations, activist groups, and revolutionary and radical groups have targeted the post office as an important site for working class organizing. So the 1970 strike took place in the context of two things. One, there was this beginning strike wave that was taking place all over the country, and particularly in the private sector. Sector rather, but also in the private sector. And then you have the Black rebellions in the US, from Watts to Detroit to Newark and more. You know, first Black Power Conference was in 1967 in Newark, 1968 in Philadelphia. And then in 68, you have the assassination of Dr. King and the rebellions in over 60 cities in the country. And so all of this comes together as the postal strike takes place. And so every worker, every Black person is in this mix, is in this moment, and they bring this into the workplace. And I think that had a lot to do with the participation that you saw. One of the famous meetings, and I think Phil deals with it in his book on the strike, that members of the community organizations, Black Panthers and others, showed up to support the strike. So this is all part of you can't separate the Black Power and Black Liberation movement from the postal strike movement of that period. And Black workers and postal unionism, it's pretty clear, have always been a part of it, as Phil pointed out, and particularly once the Jim Crow unions were broken, we've become major leaders in the craft and the industrial unions. And we say industrial, that's the multi-craft unions like the APWU. But there have been national unions since the inception of our unions, with Bill Burris, who was a Black leader out of Cleveland, becoming the first executive vice president under strike leader Mo Billa, and he served as national president for 10 years. But for nearly 4 decades, Black women and men have led urban locals across the country, providing leadership at the shop floor level, but also making connections to the broader movement in many cases. And so we've got folks like Courtney and Mack and others who are taking up that mantle And in my opinion, this is facilitated by the recent leadership in the APWU under Mark Demonstein, who's tried to change the culture from business unionism to social movement or social justice unionism, or what some of us might even call class struggle unionism. And one example is the way the union has responded to the police murders of Black men and women in this last period. I want to quickly pivot to the current conditions and the significance of the Postal Service in this moment. And so we know it operates on the principle of universal service to all. All customers have equal access to the services for the same price, right? But it represents what many call the commons. That's something that's owned by the public. And I like to example of an old friend of mine who's a red diaper baby, and his dad in New York used to take him past the New York Public Library and pull out his library card and say, son, this represents socialism, right? All of those books in there with all of that information belongs to you and me and everybody else in the city. So it's common ownership, right? And so we got to keep that in mind. This period also is an attack on the post office. The corporate privateers, like who's a business person, is moving on a decades-old agenda. It's an attack on democracy, as we saw the assault on voting by mail and destroying the service to make it the procedure fail. It's an attack on Black workers, both as members of a community that requires these services, but also as a workplace that has provided essential employment over all of these years. And then finally, it's an attack on the labor unions as it seeks to dismantle collective bargaining. So what is to be done? I want to argue that we've got to push for the stimulus money and a new postmaster general. This is something that this movement had to do, the left, the progressive movement. We've got to make the defense of the USPS a component of labor agendas in all union locals and all workers' centers and all workers' assemblies. And we got to connect the People's Postal Service with the demands for Medicare for all. Right? And this means take socialism out of the realm of ideology and make it concrete. And I think here of Amilcar Cabral, a great West African national liberation struggle leader, who said the people are fighting, they're not fighting for ideas or things in anyone's head, they're fighting to win material benefits, to live better and peace and to see their lives go forward, to guarantee the future of their children. So our demands for healthcare and a democratic public-owned communication system must become a part of the concrete demand and our vision for a transformed society. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ajamu. That was so fire. Yeah, it's a democratically owned public communication system we definitely need. We'll touch more on Medicare for all and some of those topics later. Okay, let's move on. Mac, Julian, speak to us.
Hey, Bianca, how you doing?
Good.
First, thanks. Thank you, Bianca. Thank the Democratic Socialists for having this series, this webinar. And I'm really honored to be a part of this powerful group of activists talking about the Postal Service. I was actually talking with Professor Rubio the other day because he spoke at our convention, Philadelphia, 2014. And at that time, I had not read the book. Of course, since then, I've read the book, and I just would like to say to everyone out there, whether you work for the Postal Service or not, or whether you're African American or not, to read that book. It is a well-documented history of African Americans in the Postal Service. It's very, very enlightening for me. We honor, actually this year is the 50th anniversary of the postal strike. And we honor those who went and put everything on the line back in 1970. But the fact of the matter is, if it was not for those who had preceded them, we don't get to 1970. Those men and women who were fighting for justice on the workroom floor, who was fighting the Jim Crow, they helped create an environment that made the 1970 strike possible. So if it wasn't for them, we don't get there. And of course, a lot of them had to work at the Postal Service, as Phil pointed out, because it was no other option for them. They were closed off of other opportunities. So work within the Postal Service was that opportunity, and it's no denying that the the Postal Service has been a pathway to the middle class for African Americans historically. So I just want to touch on, today, the impact that the Postal Service has in the Black community. And fact of the matter is, in a large part, it is still true that the Postal Service is a gateway for the middle class for African Americans. As president of the local here, I have an opportunity, and I make it a point to go to every orientation of all the new hires. And the fact of the matter is, many of them come from, the inner city communities, financially challenged communities, and they see the Postal Service as a great opportunity. And I tell them that, that their life is going to change because of their employment with the Postal Service. And I have actually seen firsthand that transformation. I've seen people come in, and when I tell them that one day you're going to be a homeowner, or when you're gonna own cars, you're gonna do all the things that you see other people who work for the post office do. They're very encouraged by that. I quickly share with you the story of this young lady. She's, unfortunately, you may have heard Kiera Cole, a young letter carrier who's been missing for the past couple years. And, since we've been out doing rallies and trying to I've had opportunity to meet her family and talk with some of her friends. And I think hers is kind of like a classic example of what the Postal Service do to these young lives. So she comes from a single family home. By the time she graduates high school, she had been staying with a friend and their family for a couple years. She graduates high school, and now she's working for the Postal Service. And of course, now she's making money. She's still a CCA, but she's making money, and she's starting to feel and see a way of life that she hadn't in the past. The young lady gets her first apartment. She's so excited about having an apartment. She gets a car. I hear that she was driving for Uber at night, which she wasn't supposed to do. But, her whole mindset had changed, is the point that I'm making. And I see a lot of this with those who start in the Postal Service today. It is still that pathway to the middle class for those who are fortunate enough to get a job. They become role models within the community. If they choose to stay in the community, they're adding to that tax base. They're becoming the job creators by virtue of the fact that they're, shopping and supporting the stores in that community. So it is still a tremendous impact. The Postal Service is in the Black community in terms of, being an opportunity to move those into the middle class. Although, the whole scenario has changed as it was that Phil had documented the professor documented in terms of, a necessity, the only option that there was at that time. But now it's like an option for those who don't have the opportunities to do other things, or may not be inclined to, work a white collar job. There's still, there's still work at the post office and still opportunities there. So the Postal Service still plays a tremendous role in the African American community. But again, the book is so enlightening on the role that the African American community played in terms of creating the Postal Service that we have today. Because the Postal Service that we have today don't exist in the way that it do today. That strike don't happen if it wasn't for the African Americans who preceded the strike of 1970. So I guess kind of in a way, I still see within those of us who are involved in labor in the NALC and APWU, our extension. I'm also an executive board member with the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, involved with the A. Philip Randolph Institute right here in Chicago. And also happen to be on the Chicago Federation of Labor. So, having the opportunity to have that voice heard and speak to some of the issues and the concerns in the community. I see that as, just being the legacy of those who preceded me here in Chicago. So again, thank you for the opportunity. Let others kind of chime in. We got a long way to go here.
Thank you, Mac. And I love that word that you use, legacy. I really do believe that as, Black union activists and union people, we really need to hold on to that legacy of the union being the avenue for Black folks to be able to enter the middle class and really say, we really built the Black middle class. These kinds of jobs are the staple of what makes the Black middle class in this country. And so, passing on that information to the younger generations that may not see themselves represented or a place for them in unions, I think is really important and imperative if we're going to grow into the militant labor movement that we need to be to fight to come. So thank you so much for those words, Mac.
But Bianca, let me just add, because I think we spoke about this the other day. You just said something there about, Blacks' involvement in the labor community. A lot of times, unfortunately, the African-American community don't see the labor movement as being something that's ours as well. You think of the labor movement, they may have a view or perception that labor means other people. But so that's why it's important that we are role models and we are active in the community and letting them know that labor is a part of our history as well.
Period. Thank you. All right, so last but not least, we got my brother, CBTU, under 40 colleague, Courtney Jenkins. Take us home.
Thank you, Bianca. It's good to be with you all. Thank you to the DSA. I will say this, the DSA is always stepping up and supporting the public postal service and postal workers. I mean, even since the onset of the pandemic, the DSA has been out there fighting for postal workers and the public postal service. What's interesting about this panel is that there's a generation of Black postal worker represented out of Brother Ajamu, Brother Mack, and myself. And it's really beautiful to see. And I just want to thank you two brothers for really paving the way for me to be able to sit here on this panel with you all. I think in a literal sense, when we talk about legacy, there's a legacy we see right here. So I hope the viewers are seeing that, because I would not be here without the fights of these two brothers and many other postal workers who've come before me. So I think as a young postal union leader, postal worker, whatever you want to call it, the Postal Service and postal workers unions are very intentional and great about teaching new postal workers about the history from the strike to before the strike until now. And I think that's something that, again, like President Dempsey and folks like that are really, really good with, making sure we know our stuff. I know whenever he's come to talk to young members, it's always been about, do you know your history? So again, I just want to thank folks with that. I will say that I like to talk to folks that are about to retire. And I've been at the Postal Service a little over a decade now. And one of the things, especially our Black postal workers will say is when they're about to retire is, CJ, the Postal Service has been good to me. I have no complaints. And I can say, I'm nowhere near retirement, but the Postal Service has been good to me. And on two fronts. And the two fronts that these retirees, soon to be retirees, talk about is that economic security, but also the exposure. For someone who looks like me, who's from a city like me, where Hopkins did a study that said that every year I stayed in Baltimore, my earning potential would drop by 9%. So the sense of economic security, a foundation, where I was in my early 20s when I got the job with the Postal Service. And to know that as long as there's honest days work for an honest day's pay and I show up to work, I could retire from here. And I could live a life with economic security and know that many of my peers in Baltimore City may not have had the same. And again, the only difference was that I worked for the Postal Service, and through that, I found one of the largest unionized workplaces left in the nation. So I don't want us to be mistaken that a lot of this security and a lot of the things that Black postal workers have been able to do is because there is a labor union present to represent the workers in the workplace, and it helps level that playing field. The Postal Service has been a great equalizer, but that's a lot of part due to 4 major postal workers unions and the many postal workers unions that came before the Great Strike. We would not be here today. The wages and benefits that we talk about when we talk about economic security, the fact that I can take vacation time, and not have to worry about, missing wages because I want to go do something in my leisure. These are things that many Black workers are still fighting to have, and get. And those are the benefits that any worker should have. But being at the Postal Service has, definitely secured that for Black working people. And, you know, the fact that we have everything in a collective bargaining agreements, which prohibits discrimination in the workplace. Or, you know, as a young Black person, there's a sense of security that comes from knowing that I can open my CBA and look at my pay scale and in a sense plan out the rest of my life. You know, I know like this won't change unless, you know, for some crazy reason we stop fighting, and I never see that happening. But I know, you know, again, I can set up my lifestyle based upon these things were brought through collective bargaining. And you know, not many Black workers, just with a high school diploma, like many of us, many Black postal workers, you know, are able to have that type of security. So moving on to exposure, through the Postal Service and really through the American Postal Workers Union, I've been exposed to a lot. I had really gotten a free education in a sense, you know, through my labor union, through being a member and then going on to be a local officer. But to point out that the three largest postal workers unions in our organization, the American Postal Workers Union, are run by African American men. So, you know, the exposure of having those type of role models. Our brother Jonathan Smith of the New York Metro local, our brother Keith Richardson of the Chicago area local, and brother Dominic Davis of the Los Angeles local. So these brothers are mentors to me. And it's so that exposure, having that, seeing someone who looks like me, who comes from a similar Black background, a similar place, who views the world through a similar lens, that is empowering. So, you know, not just about the security of a good wage and decent benefits, but also that platform to know that, you know, if I want to become a leader, if I want to fight for my coworkers, there are people that look like me and I feel more welcomed. You know, it makes me feel more comfortable. Again, I can call Brother Keith or Brother Dominic or Brother Smith and get that advice that, you know, someone else may not be able to give me. You know, and that is really comforting and really empowering and a secure feeling. Since 2009, since about the beginning of my career, I would say the Postal Service has changed drastically. And I would say the threats of privatization, especially, which have caused, you know, the downsizing of our workforce, the additional non-career tier workforce where wages are lower, you know, and there's less benefits for employees. I say that does impact a future generation of Black postal workers. You know, I will say that, you know, postal workers coming in now, they may not have that same sense of security that you may have had 10 or 15 or 20 years ago coming as a Black postal worker. However, they still recognize that they're much better off here than a lot of other workplaces, a lot of other of our private competitors. You know, those big box retail chains that don't have union representation. As someone who does new employee orientations, and, you know, my goal is to sign new members up to the American Postal Workers Union in Baltimore, I see a lot of young Black workers coming in who may not have had a structured workforce like the Postal Service, who may have never heard of what a labor union is. I'll ask that question to a lot of folks, and some of them don't know what a union does, doesn't know what its function is, and doesn't know the benefits. And I say I'm a living example of the power of the Postal Service and, you know, the Black community, but also, you know, the power of labor unions in the Black community. I wouldn't be sitting in this panel, I would not be a local union officer or a CBTU local chapter president had it not been for my connection and employment with the Postal Service, but also the presence of a labor union in the workplace. So while these threats are happening now, I feel I'm more optimistic since yesterday, especially. But we've seen, you know, the downsizing of our workforce, the shuttering of processing plants and facilities, the attempt to remove 6-day delivery, and change post office hours and take out local post offices. So for all those watching, I just want you all to remember, again, an attack on the Postal Service is also an attack on the Black community. It's two sides. It's not just about the jobs, but also the service it provides. Going back to what Brother Ajamu said, that universal service means that we deliver to everyone. We don't exclude. And what we've seen even more be exacerbated by this pandemic is that the Postal Service is a lifeline to communities. I know a lot of times the tagline is the Postal Service is a lifeline to the rural community. However, the Postal Service is also a lifeline to a lot of urban communities and a lot of predominantly Black communities, or where people are living at or below the poverty line. And we've seen that, whether it be us delivering that stimulus check, literally, making sure that it gets into the hands of people who need it the most, or again, providing that space of affordable shipping. You know, you go to a private company, you look at competitors of the Postal Service, and it's going to cost you exponentially more to deliver that same size package to that same city. Or, you know, you don't see a lot of our competitors, you know, coming through, again, those communities that live at or below the poverty level. They rely on the Postal Service to do that. So again, when we see the downsizing of our service, the downsizing of our workforce, that impacts people like me, or those folks who, like Brother Ajamu and Brother Mack, who paid it forward for me. I'm trying to pay it forward for that next generation of postal workers, you know, especially that young Black person who, again, is looking for something as opposed to an alternative, which, you know, they don't want to go to. I'm on the work floor every night. I'm a shop steward, and one of the things that hits me a lot, especially during the pandemic, and when the news was breaking about how the Postal Service was going to run out of money, and you know what would happen next, I had a lot of young Black postal workers coming to me and saying, "CJ, I don't want to do what I was doing before this. I can't do what I was doing before this, you know." And what happens if this place closes down? What happens if I lose my job? These are real conversations that we're having on the workforce and our members come to us with. But again, these are young Black folks who say, that sense of security I felt prior to this new postmaster or prior to the pandemic, I don't feel that anymore. I'm a single parent, and I thought I would be able to retire from here and, you know, put my kids through school and become a homeowner and maybe start my small business and use this as a platform. That sense of security is not here anymore. And again, I'm going back to what I first said with my comments. Being a young 20-something young Black man in Baltimore, having this job and having this security and knowing that no matter what, as long as I show up to work and I put in an honest day's work, I could retire. I didn't have to worry about a lot of the things that my peers are worrying about. So these recent attacks that we've seen, and especially over the past decade, we should all be ready for what may come, you know, with this new Postmaster General. I fully intend that he will continue to try to carry out the mission or whatever that mission was that he had to really, you know, push us further towards privatization. But just remember that those attacks are going to impact communities of color on a twofold level, from decent wage jobs with great benefits to also that universal service that we provide to every address 6 days a week.
Thank you so much, CJ, for grounding us, particularly in this moment and what you all are experiencing throughout this global pandemic that's raging on. And so I just want to remind people that we will have time for questions just in a little bit. And so if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and hopefully we can get to them at the end of this. I want to move on now to some questions, some follow-up questions. So we're going to start with you, Mac. You spoke about the relationship between the post office and the community. I wanted to bring up postal banking. So I wonder if you can tell us, what is postal banking and why people should support it?
Okay, postal banking. Let me first just add, Courtney, you didn't have to tell everybody I wasn't in the under 40, man. I don't think they quite knew.
Sorry, brother.
No. So postal banking, and let me say, I want to shout out to our national president, Fred Rolando of the NALC, who's actually one of the participants who's listening or watching this evening. When I first started with being an activist, it was, you know, largely for the stuff on the workroom floor, addressing issues, you know, that fight on the workroom floor. And I have evolved over time, and in large part due to our national union, the NALC, who, you know, we're part of the Grand Alliance now with all the other unions fighting for, you know, the Postal Service. You know, you can't just be a union activist and not fight for the company with whom your members work, who are represented. So, you know, with that said, one of the biggest things that we with the NALC have been doing and educating and fighting for is other things that the Postal Service can do, other uses for the Postal Service that could be both beneficial to the Postal Service and the community. And of course, postal banking is one of them. Years ago, banking was a part of one of those services that was offered by the post office. And now, you know, where you have over, when Senator Warren and Senator Sanders put forth a bill the other a few years back, trying to get postal banking, they saw where over 70 million Americans was underbanked. In that, you know, they get their paycheck and they have to go to these check cashing places to cash their checks. They often fall prey to these predatory lenders because they have no banking. If if the Postal Service was allowed to serve this community and, allowed to give small loans and the things that they can do with the Postal Service, you realize there's like 30,000 locations all across the country. And so if I wanted to send some more money, for example, to my daughter in California, I could go to the post office right around the corner. She can pick it up from the post office right down the street from where she lives without these high fees that these other entities are charging. And of course, that would be something that will benefit the Postal Service as well. It is, I mean, we are, the infrastructure is there. We are located in every community. It will provide for those who are underbanked and don't have, the resources to probably open up an account in some of these larger banks, the opportunity to have banking services. It seemed to make so much sense. That's probably why we don't have it right now. It's just obvious, but I think again, that will be a win-win for both the communities all across the country and the Postal Service.
Thank you, Mac, for breaking that down for us. Does anybody else want to chime in or say more about postal banking on the panel? Okay.
Bianca, if I could for 1 second.
Yep, sure.
A little late with the mute button. So in the literal sense, in a city like Baltimore, you have these corner stores that cash paychecks. So, you have a routine where I'm a worker and I go into this liquor store and I cash my paycheck and I walk out with a wad of cash, right? How secure is that? So going back to what I was talking about, economic security and it being twofold, something like postal banking gives me a secure sense that when I walk into the post office, I typically don't trust that corner store that I'm going into. No one in there may look like me, right? But I walk into the post office, which is of my community, right? And I know that I can store my money in a secure location because again, I don't trust banks. I may be putting my money under a mattress or in my sock drawer, right? Walking around with that type of cash. So I think the Postal Service could also bring folks into the e-banking world because many of Black communities are being left out of that. Without access to a traditional bank account or a debit card, or a debit card that you don't have to pay exorbitant fees with, I'm locked out of that commerce. How do I order things online? How have I participated in this somewhat new economy that we have in this pandemic, where everything is, Uber Eats and DoorDash or, Instacart, right? Like if I don't have a bank account or a debit card, I cannot use those services. I'm putting myself at risk by going out there every day. So I think, again, the idea of security on a few different levels, postal banking brings, especially again to cities like Baltimore, where there are banking deserts, much like there are food deserts, where banks are saying, hey, this community isn't profitable. We're going to pull out. And the Postal Service is just saying, hey, let us serve those communities that you don't want. You're telling us you don't want these communities. You don't want to. We're not here to really make a profit. We're here to provide a service. And there's a post office in every zip code. In those zip codes where there isn't a bank, and we're just saying, hey, let us come and serve those people. The postal workers unions are.
Thank you, CJ. Yes, and I'm so proud to say that DSA has been a partner, an active partner in the fight for postal banking. And so if you don't have an active campaign for that in your chapter, maybe look to folks in Philly and New York City who have been canvassing around this for a couple years now. Okay, so let's move on. So Ajamu, I want to come to you. You've mentioned the connection between present day Black liberation struggles and postal struggles. I wonder if you'll elaborate more specifically with how you see the connection existing since the recent uprising after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, et cetera, this summer.
Sure, but could I just divert and just bring up two other points quickly and get to that in my time? One, CJ just talked about the privileged role that we have as Black workers in contrast to many in our community. And during my time in leadership, I argued always that we have an obligation as Black postal workers, right, to help those in our community who don't have those same privileges, so that we should participate in union organizing drives where we can. In today's time, that would be helping people fighting for 15, for example. But in local areas where people are trying to organize in their plant or whatever, we have to do that. We owe it to our community. You know, you talked about paying it forward. Courtney, that's part of the role. I think that Black postal workers who've got this privilege that we fought for and that's under attack is to use our role. The other thing I wanted to raise up is Black women leaders. I mean, it got lost in the sauce here, you know, in terms of our representation, but also in terms of the history. But, you know, let it be known that Black women, American Postal Union, are organized in Power, Post Office Women for Equal Rights, a really powerful organization. During my time, the leaders of the New York Metro Local, DC, Baltimore, Richmond, Virginia, and a number of others were led by very powerful women. And even today, the Secretary Treasurer, American Postal Workers Union, is a very important leader. So I just think, you know, wanted to do that. So to your question, I think that it's important that the Postal Service, as I pointed out, becomes part of the demands that Black people are making on the ground. Okay, so whether it has to do with voter suppression, whether it has to do with defund the police, Medicare for all of those things have to be brought into this broad agenda. So all of the organizations, Black Youth Project 100, Movement for Black Lives, all of these organizations have to be lifting up the Postal Service as part of this demand, okay? As part of the commons, as part of the fight for a new kind of agenda that's out there. And, you know, I think that it's not easy to get people out because sometimes, going back to this privilege, when you get this privilege, sometimes you think you're okay. And you don't need to fight. And so we've got to overcome that in this moment. And again, Courtney gives us a good example. You look at that collective bargaining agreement and that pay scale and whatnot, but at this time, you can't do that because it's under attack, it's in jeopardy, and you may not be able to do that. So we've got to fight to really get people engaged in the social movement. And I really hope that the victory of the last does not bring people into complacency. The fight has just begun. We're going to have to push on this new administration, both on postal issues, on issues around the police, and all of these other things, and just ready for that.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, so CJ, I want to turn back to you. Postal workers have been through a lot this year, and you mentioned some of the struggles that you all have had. I wonder what are your reflections or lessons that you've learned in the past year, and what do you want to ask or demand, rather, of the new administration?
Wow, that's a good question. As I reflect, part of what I reflect on and what I've learned is that working class people get the short end of the stick every time. I walk into work every night and there's this big sign and it says heroes work here on the side of the building. But first, we didn't ask to be heroes or anyone to call us heroes, but also, you know, where's the dignity and respect of things like my folks come to me and say, what about hazard pay? What about, you know, making sure we have a constant flow of PPE? You know, I think I've seen a lot of pain in people's eyes. What you do as a representative on the work floor, and my workforce is predominantly African-American. It's not all African-American, but they're predominantly African-American. So all those issues that the Black community and we as Black working people face has been exacerbated. And I've had to see that 8 hours, 5 days a week. You know, so to realize that this is all very real. And again, like, you know, when America catches the coronavirus, Black people catch the coronavirus on steroids. But I've also realized and learned that labor unions are amazing vehicles when we talk about providing equity to all communities. And I say that because at the onset, our labor unions that represent postal workers were coming up with memorandums of understanding to protect leave and provide different leave to like our non-career workforce. That was one of the really great things that I saw on the onset. Our non-career workforce, they had all the postal workers union that come out to provide additional paid leave, recognizing that these folks, because they weren't career employees, didn't accumulate you know, a lot of paid leave like I would as a career employee, Brother Mack or Brother Ajamu. And again, recognizing that the majority of these non-career workers in my workplace were young Black postal workers. So having that additional paid leave and that security meant the difference between them keeping the lights on and becoming evicted, or you know, being able to provide for their child. And things like the FFCRA, which provided the expansion of FMLA. Because we work at the Postal Service, we were entitled to that as well. And you know how many moms have come to me or dads have come to me and said, I don't know, without that benefit, how I would have juggled work and being on a virtual Zoom for, you know, making sure my child was in school and learning. And recognizing that these things, that security, that sense of security in a very uncertain time, you know, was the big difference maker for a lot of young Black postal workers and Black postal workers in general. But we have a lot of young folks coming through now, and they come to me. You know, what I've seen is there's a fire in their eyes. They want to know what's going on, what this union is about, what is, you know, what can it really do, and they're starting to see the strength of it, and what we do when we come together. Because a lot of these issues now, the coronavirus has impacted everyone, right? It's not, you know, sectored off in the workplace. So they're starting to see that, hey, you know, this union is stepping up for all of us, but you know, the majority of us are Black. And going back to what Brother Ajamu said, we cannot forget our Black sisters and our Black postal worker sisters in the Postal Service and leadership, especially within the union. The top 2 officers in my local are Black women. The top 3 are the other presidents in the largest locals in the state of Maryland. President Sherry McKnight of my local, President Dina Briscoe of the nation's capital metro area local, and President Nanette Corley of the Montgomery County area local are all 3 Black women. So, you know, again, what I've seen is those sisters step up for their membership in the middle of a pandemic. I always say, like, Black women save us all, right? Constantly, every time, right? And what we're seeing is that happen now. What I would demand of this new administration is to follow through with the party's platform to the T. It was only about a paragraph that addressed the Postal Service and the DNC platform, but we fully expect President-elect Biden and anyone surrounding that administration to protect the public postal service, to ensure that we have 6-day delivery, door-to-door delivery, you know, to expand options at the Postal Service like postal banking. You know, President-elect Biden said, you know, the African-American community has stood with him. A lot of those folks were African-American postal workers, you know, in the Postal Workers Union. So what we demand is that he follow through with every part of that platform that addresses the Postal Service and infrastructure as a whole, but, you know, the Postal Service, and recognizes that this is still a place for Black working people to find, you know, decent wage employment with good benefits and a path from the working class. I've literally seen in my career, folks go from working class to middle class to even upper middle class. So, you know, we want an administration, whether it's Republican, Democrat, or anything else, to continue to protect the public postal service for generations of customers and workers to come.
Right on, and we'll be right there fighting along with you. All right, so Phil, I wonder if you can talk about how we can learn, what lessons can we apply to continue to fight to address the crisis at USPS? We know that there are constant attacks, and I think that people don't even have a real sense, everyday people, about how much the Postal Service is under attack. And so I wonder if you could talk about what we should expect coming, what the fight's going to entail, and how can we draw on past lessons to get a victory in the future.
Sorry, I had to find my unmute button. And yeah, speaking of mute, I'm also a belated thanks, Bianca and DSA, for inviting me to participate in this fantastic panel. So I'm going to make this short because I did go over and I want other questions to be added. But I mean, in my my latest book, Undelivered, I talk about the spirit of 1970 as a kind of follow-up to my last book, There's Always Work at the Post Office. That spirit of the Wildcatters who you know, it was illegal to strike the post office, but they felt so confident being unionized. I mean, they defied their own union leadership, and their feeling was the nation depends on us. You know, they're going to fire all of us. And I mean, there's no social media back then, but there might as well have been. You know, they heard about each other's walkouts on the radio. So I think we can borrow from that kind of spirit, you know, that kind of uprising that, you know, forced changes. But unfortunately, we also got a compromise. And I think, you know, as Courtney and Mack and Ajamu pointed out, we should expect from a Biden administration, you know, to make the post office more like a service and less like a business. And hope that DeJoy resigns and moves out, you know, because you know, he can't be fired or removed. But there's the kind of struggles that we saw break out in 2020 has just been pointed out as an intervention into police violence, you know, really changed the landscape that was led by Black youth, you know, and millions of people in the streets. That changed the dynamic. The outrage as a parallel this last summer by postal consumers, you know, is also something that can be organized and used along with, for instance, SaveThePostOffice.com has proposed a new postal commission, new presidential commission. There have been 4 of these so-called task forces since '67, since the Capitol Commission. They've all been, you know, corporate or executive branch or academics, but you know, we actually need participation by labor and consumers to put the Postal Service on a, for once and for all, back on a public footing, so that it you know, it doesn't have to endure these kind of attacks that we've seen.
Thank you so much, Phil. So I think people have more questions about lessons from the 70s, and so we'll use this last 10 minutes to do Q&A. These questions that are going to be for anyone who wants to answer them, so feel free to chime in, anybody, unless somebody designates it specifically to somebody. So let's get started with the first question. So Nikki Bracey says, the constant threats to privatize the post office would likely have detrimental impacts on the Black community and Americans at large. How can we stop the threats to privatize the post office once and for all? And that's to everyone.
Well, you know what, I'll jump in on that, because right now, you know, I kind of believe that we have the wind at our backs in this fight. I have not seen what I've seen, what transpired this past summer in over 12 years of representation, where it seemed like we've always been fighting for postal reform and educating the public about the post office. And literally when the former president, he's former now, actually threatened the Postal Service and the response from our customers, from the constituency in each of these congressional districts. And I mean, there were people who were out having Save Our Post Office rallies that we weren't, you know, that we were not the ones involved in starting these rallies or planning these rallies. You know, Keith Richardson, APWU here in Chicago, we're like, okay, there's a rally over here, there's a rally, and we didn't put it together. It was the community themselves. I think we have to continue to advocate, obviously, for the Postal Service, educate. I mean, there's been more than a few occasions when, you know, yes, African Americans who work for the Postal Service would be adversely impacted. But, you know, the reality of it is that, you know, if you live in Chicago, you think that postal workers are predominantly African Americans. It's like 70 to 80% here African American. But the fact of the matter is only like a quarter of the Postal Service workforce nationwide. We are 30% veterans. It is a diverse workforce, and we service every community. I think we have to keep getting those facts out there to the general public. We have to educate, continue to educate But right now, like I said, I think we have the winds at our backs. And, you know, the whole relevancy thing, if we take anything from COVID, it shows that how relevant the Postal Service is today and how reliable. You know, our customers have the response from our customers. I hear from the carriers all the time, and the response that they get from their customers, the appreciation. I mean, damn, we're working, we're working during a pandemic, and we have not been immune to it. I mean, we're starting to see a surge across the country. We're starting to see a surge in the Chicago post office. But our members are dedicated and they're coming to work. So I think we have to continue to educate people and continue to advocate for the Postal Service.
Yeah, if I could just, that was a great point, Mac. I just want to throw this in real quickly. That since 2011, we've had that spirit of 1970. You know, in 2011, there was resistance to the pre-funding and the enormous debt that Congress saddled the Postal Service with. So there's legislation that we could push to have that, but activist organizations from 2011, Save Our People's Postal Service, to 2015, the Grand Alliance, to today's Stand By Your Mail, postal labor and consumer coalitions, I think should be working together to try to get this ball across the goal line.
Thank you, Phil. Let's move on. So there's a couple, I want to start to combine some questions just for time. There's a couple questions piggybacking off of this question of privatization. Both Daniel Shea and Gabe Gordon asked similar questions, which is really, the question is about retirement security and about, so let me just read Gabe's question. So many postal workers I know, says Gabe, at least in Brooklyn, New York, repeatedly have told me how a younger generation of postal workers are less inclined to see their job at the post office as a career position and only see it as something temporary because of the threats of privatization. Is this evident across the country, and how has it impacted union activity and our ability to collectively build power? That was to CJ, but anyone can answer.
Well, I'll quickly say those things are true. Again, like the Postal Service as a place of employment isn't necessarily as attractive as it has been. And I'll say literally, I started my career and I was the last group of full-time regular clerks that came through my facility. Everybody that came in after that was a casual employee or now a Postal Service employee, or PSC. So, you know, there is a new crop of folks who don't look at this as maybe a place to retire from, but they also still recognize that this is still a place of decent wages and, you know, decent benefits. And it's a platform at this point for a lot of young Black postal workers, especially. They see that, you know, decent wages, you know, I have a union to represent me and fight for my best interest. And, you know, this will be where what I use to get into maybe another part of the government, you know, another sector of the government, which happens often, has happened historically. You know, my stepmom started at the Postal Service and went to work for CMS, you know, and retired from the government. But those things, the young postal workers, even like myself, when I speak of retirement security, I speak in the sense that I know, you know, those things are going to always be under attack, but to know that I have a union that's going to have my back. And at the end of the day, it's going to fight for that to be there. Where a lot of other workplaces, we've seen what's happened to pensions and a lot of other workplaces, or, you know, retirement benefits. So, you know, we know that there's always going to be a fight, but to know as a young Black male living in Baltimore that there's going to be someone there to fight with me, that's where that sense of security comes from when I talk about retiring and just having a career.
And you know, let me just say, I think, you know, the fact that we are federal employees, our retirement will be secure. I think let's look at what's really driving this whole privatization talk, and that is the fact that the Postal Service generates $68 billion of revenue annually. 68 billion, that's a huge pie. And so there are those out there who want to slice up that pie. And of course, that would be at the cost to the American people because they would try to take advantage of the service and, you know, charge more in areas that, you know, that cost more to deliver or that are, not as profitable at some of the more affluent areas. So, I mean, yeah, we want to fight and make sure that we keep the public, this public agency, just that, a public agency. It belongs to the people. It's the people's post office. And again, that goes back to the educating, that the Postal Service belongs to the people and it's written into the Constitution. So, you know, retirement wise, we will be okay. But the bigger picture is, what's really driving this whole privatization, what it's all about. I think we have to educate on that.
Thank you, Mac. And we're just going to do one more question quickly. So let's make the answers quick. You all literally delivered us to a victory in this last election. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Mail-in ballots played a huge role. And so going forward, how important is mail-in voting in every state for access to the vote? We want to talk about the significance of the mail-in voting and access to that. That's for anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear, of course, a number of states, I don't know the exact number now, I think with 5 or 6 have used this historically and had no problems with it. And in the context of the pandemic, it was just absolutely essential. But I think even post-pandemic, and how you define that is another discussion about what does post-pandemic look like. But I think elections going forward are going to use mail-in ballots more, and we should even encourage and support that. And as a part of it, I mean, the attack that we had, on us, on the integrity of postal workers, and using examples of a one-off postal employee who had some, a ballot or some mail in his trunk to impugn the whole workforce has got to be defended against. And so I think as part of our discussions going forward, we talk about mail-in ballots. That's part of the franchise, that you should be able to mail in your ballot.
And postal workers were heroes, taking my ballot by mail, getting it through, despite Postmaster General DeJoy's attempts to slow it down. 64 million people voted by mail, in the worst pandemic in a century.
I think the American people see it works now. I think it will get bigger. I know it's something that we've been advocating for the NALC across the country and different legislators, state legislators, trying to get vote by mail as a primary way to voting. And we've seen what happened to this, in this last election. And those mail-in votes, they arrived, didn't they?
They sure did. Well, I just want to thank all of our panelists for such an informative discussion tonight. I know I, for one, learned a ton. I also want to thank the DSA Labor Commission, or the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission, rather, for putting on this series and organizing this call. This has been so amazing. I encourage all of you, there are a lot of questions about, I'm not a postal worker, how can I support? I encourage all of you to look up postal banking in your area. You can canvass around that. As Max said, you don't even need to be a part of the Postal Service. You can throw rallies to save the Postal Service. So look that up in your area. We all have our part to do. So without further to say, thank you so much. Peace and blessings to you all. Have a good night.